Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dustin Cormier. This is How to Rock Astrology. Today we're going to be continuing our series on defining the stability and positive conductivity of an outer planet, which you have found to have significance in your chart or in the chart of somebody that you're reading about. To learn more about significance, check out the series before this one. This series is for once you've found significance. This is how we determine the stability and positive conductivity of the planets related to the agenda of that outer planet. Welcome. We're going to be talking about, in particular today, the Lajitaadi Avastas. Now this, for me, is a critical part of this course because, of course, if you've been into Vedic for a while, you ought to know that the Lajitaadi Avastas are considered possibly the most critical determiner of the nature of how a planet's going to come out. Ernst Wilhelm actually kind of alludes to this in an incredible piece of writing that he's done. He's got an incredible free PDF that you can find on Google just by looking it up. It's Lajitaadi Avastas, Brihat Parashara Horoshastra's method of how planets influence planets. Because, you know, like, it's so easy for us to just determine the strength of a planet by its dignity, by the sign it's in, and even, you know, by Graha aspects. But the Graha aspects are a surface interaction, whereas the Lajitaadi Avastas are a deeper and more pertinent dimension of aspects. Graha aspects and Lajitaadi Avastas are almost kind of combined, although Lajitaadi Avastas also they combine the dignity as well, the dignity of the sign that you're in. So this is an important dimension of a chart. This little quote comes from Ernst Wilhelm, from this same article that we've just described. And in here, he's going to talk about the essence of a planet's expression, trying to express its inherent nature. How a planet expresses its inherent nature depends on the influences on that planet and whether those influences relate positively to its desired expression. Because each of us is a spider web of unconscious forces, and the more that those unconscious forces in our nature can be expressed at their nature, the more we can find fulfillment, as Ernst tells us. So, to read the quote, each planet craves the fulfillment of its goals, as signified by the planet's inherent nature, and lived out by the bhavas it rules. Bhavas, of course, meaning houses. So, the planet itself not only just has an unconscious nature as to the nature of the planet, all the planets are what they are regardless of your lagna. But you come through with a lagna in this incarnation, and the lagna is kind of like the first filter. I mean, the planet itself has no filter, but it has to express through the many filters of our karma. And one of the first karmic filters, we could say, is the lagna. So a planet can only express itself based on the houses that planet represents for the lagna, no matter what you are. We've been looking at Charlie Sheen, who's a Gemini rising. So if we're going to talk about the sun for Charlie Sheen, the sun has its own nature, but it also has the third house emphasis for a Gemini rising. They're blended, and you cannot separate the sun from the third house nature in a Gemini rising chart. And it relates to the nature of fulfillment for that planet. To continue, fulfillment is the result of following natural laws of spiritual, emotional, energetic, and physical living. That's a beautiful line that is deep and true. Only by following these natural laws is fulfillment possible. Any act that does not follow these laws results in a wasted life, disappointment, disordered living, and illness. Parashara's Lajitaadi Avastas reveal these natural laws in an astrological language, while also allowing us to see how each person is living in accordance with these laws or in detriment to them. It's a weird thing because your planet could have a karma that expresses an ill Lajitaadi Avasta placement, and it could completely cripple the otherwise potentials that could be written into a chart, but we have to live by the effects that the planet that is trying to express itself, how it influences other planets and how those other planets influence it. We have to live with this. And so, I always think of like the soul in terms of like ergonomics. It's like you notice that a glove is designed to fit the human hand. That's why gloves sell, because we're humans. We have a certain way that we are, and gloves perfectly fit that, and that's why gloves are a commonly used item in human history, all throughout human history, because the design, the purpose fits the design, and that's why they do well. Glove business is killing it forever. So in the same way, if you have a sun, that sun is always going to do better if it's placed in a way in the chart through which the sun can best express what the sun is and does, right? But usually all of us have at least one or two planets that are doing what the planet's supposed to do at their best, while everything else moves to the tune of that. So, astrologers often place great emphasis on the bhavas in which planets are located, their dignities, the yogas they form, the influence from benefics and malefics, etc. We've actually, this whole time, we've been describing everything up to this point as basically that, right? Bhavas the planets in. We talked about the dignities of the Sun and Mercury, the yogas of Sun and Mercury in this chart, the influence from benefics and malefics, that was our Graha Aspects. But the single most important consideration that far outweighs any other consideration or group of considerations are the influences that a planet receives from its friends and enemies. Now, we're going to see in Charlie Sheen's chart, this basically is going to come out neutral, just like the last few things that we've been doing. But that's just significant. That's just Charlie Sheen's chart. It's a funny neutrality that this outer planet reading ends up being. But not everyone is going to be like this. Sometimes if a planet is steeped to the brim with deeply meaningful and supportive Lajitaadi Avastas aspects, it's a huge support to that planet. But also if that planet shows a lot of negative scores, it's a huge detriment to the way that planet can express itself. So when we consider Lajitaadi Avastas, what makes it up is the relationship, the natural relationships between the planets. This isn't a temporary relationship thing. This is based on pure natural relationships between the planets. This little chart basically comes from this same PDF that Ernst Wilhelm gave us. You can see, for example, with Mercury, if Mercury is placed in Leo, then it's in a friendly sign. If Mercury is placed in Libra or Taurus, it's in a friendly sign. But if Mercury. If Mercury is placed in Libra or Taurus, it's good. If Mercury is placed in Scorpio, or if it receives aspects from Mars, it's going to be neutral. There won't be any Lajitaadi Avastas to have to deal with. But if Mercury is aspected by the moon, or if Mercury is in Cancer, then it's going to take negative Shad Bala influence from the moon. And the moon is very strong in Charlie Sheen's chart. So these are all things we have to consider. In fact, the Sun and Mercury are both hit by the moon. What's interesting is that we know that the moon... So see, here we have the moon here. The moon is basically trine Mercury, and it's close enough that it's also trine the Sun. That's why the Sun is receiving points from the moon. Now, when a planet, we could go through all the Lajitaadi Avastas. Maybe one day I will, just for the sake of it, because it'd be a good class. But the sun, the moon being trine the sun and the moon, as we know from our previous, we could see that the moon is friendly to the sun, which means that since the moon is in trine with the sun, it's going to delight it. That's what happens when you're in a Oh, come on. Sometimes this thing gives me crap. There we go. So that's how we know that the moon being trine the sun is going to give the sun some positive influence. And that positive influence when it comes to aspects has everything to do with how strong the aspect is. We haven't shown it here, but in our last class we saw that the moon does aspect to the sun to 22 points, right? It's not a huge amount, but it's something, and that's why we're including it as Lajitaadi Avasta. It seems small. It's 206 points out of the moon's possible 556 points of delight. Because the moon is the sun's friend, the moon being an aspect gives the sun 206 Shad Bala points to its normal Shad Bala. This, if it weren't for this pesky Saturn down here, this moon alone would give the sun enough Shad Bala to be able to sufficiently complete on a regular basis the Shad Bala that the sun requires to work at its most sufficient, because we know from our Shad Bala course, if we wanted to dig way back there, my computer sucks right now. So we know that the Shad Bala of the sun is at about 80%. This is from our 2 classes ago. The sun is at 80% of its required Shad Bala strength, being only 300 points out of like 390, which is what I think it needs. So, with the moon giving its friend, the sun, 206 points of its Shad Bala, that would lift the sun up to about 500. It's way in the mark where it needs its Shad Bala. But Jupiter also gives the sun some of its extra points, right? With 246. So let's take a moment here, and basically we're going to check out, just like we did before, we're going to consider the sun's Lajitaadi Avastas, because of course, as we've been talking about throughout this course, the sun is the dispositor for Mercury, and Mercury is the one holding the outer planet energy. So the sun's capacity to do its agenda as the third lord in this 4th house, the more it can do that, the more it can express itself, the more it can find positive channels for its energy. That is in turn channeling Mercury and working out the outer planet agenda of giving 4th house compulsion and energy and egotism. We know from the Uranus, it's a control. It's at a basic neurological intuition level, teaching Charlie Sheen to use its intuitions of Uranus to keep itself self-realized and wondering and happy and moving, being in the Uranus in the 4th house. The sun's capacity to express itself, to find things, channels to do with its energy, will help Mercury, and this will help the outer planets, and this will help Uranus work out its agenda. By the sun's wandering and finding 3rd house things to do, this is how Uranus is going to express its control of itself and its own inner universe of emotions. Hopefully, ideally, if the sun is well placed, and etc. And the same thing with Mercury. Same thing with Pluto. We know that Sheen has probably an emotional probably has a fixation with his own solar energy, being conjunct Pluto here in general. But in particular, Pluto in the 4th house itself has an egotism when it comes to Charlie Sheen, feeling like he himself is worthy at home. He himself in his emotional depths, because Pluto is there, he's trying to redeem the inner feelings of not feeling worthy of emotional stability and goodness. And the sun is going to help him do that. And these Lajitaadi Avastas are going to help the sun find ways and support for the expression of its third house energy. The moon does it through self-nourishment, adapting oneself and adapting the world around oneself so as to fulfill one's needs. Mom might have actually helped his ability to do the sun thing, to express his noble desires for what he wants to do with himself. Maybe his skills, maybe his ability to communicate. Speak, boy! Even if she was like, there's a lot of craziness in the fourth house, which shows some questionable activity regarding Sheen's mother. Although his moon is very well placed, especially with the Lajitaadi Avastas, but the moon is also his highest Shad Bala planet. So despite all this ugliness in the fourth house, he might have actually had a good mother and probably does attract good, positive relationships. Again, it's a matter of what he does with it. That's the question. This aggressive sun in the fourth house does not help his ability. It's almost like he does get lucky relationships and a good mother and women in his life, but he has to press to the perimeter of his luck with this because the hungry third lord, the sun, is with it all. But in any case, the moon does help the sun to express itself here. The moon delights the sun, and the delight is this Lajitaadi Avasta. When the moon delights the sun, the individual seeks nourishment, the moon, through the pursuit of their creative inspirations, the sun. So it's like this, because they seek nourishment of themselves through the sun and their pursuit of creative inspirations, just this desire itself is putting more energy and support into the sun, because the sun knows it's going to feel good and nurtured when it finds creative inspiration. This is a healthy strategy that gives a feeling of focused excitement and purpose to life, which fill the needs of the heart and the mind, and which gives direction. Because the moon is being fulfilled through the sun, this gives the sun direction. And he did find some joy in his creative inspirations, as we know about Charlie Sheen, right? So that's the moon delighting the sun. Now what happens when Jupiter is also trine the sun. Now you'll notice, of course, that Jupiter has no enemies. It's neutral to quite a few things, but the moon is an enemy to no one. What is it? The moon has no enemies. And Jupiter is an enemy to no one, because Jupiter is just the great benefic. That's how it rolls. But Jupiter happens to rule a fire and water sign. It's in the group of Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Moon. That's its own sort of special group. And so therefore, the Jupiter is friendly to the sun, and that's why when Jupiter is trine the sun, as it is here, I mean, like, the orb of trine is different in Western than it is in Vedic. We see that if it were truly trine, then the sun would have to be at the end of Libra. Here the sun is here in Virgo, but the sun does still receive some aspect. God, my computer sucks today. Quit it. I'm just showing you guys this just so you can see what I mean when I say that. This is like the aspects of the planets in the Rashi chart. And we see that Jupiter is in trine to the sun at 28 points. And it's interesting that it's like almost like really sextile. And that's why it's only half of its full point. If the sun were here at the end of Libra, that 28 would turn into 60 points out of 60, right? But it's only half because it's only half of the possible trine angle. So that's why Jupiter gives the sun half of its Shad Bala out of 523, out of a possible 523, because 523 is Jupiter's Shad Bala, and it's the Shad Bala strength that gives itself through the Lajitaadi Avastas. Now, Jupiter is a great benefic, and it helps the sun in general. It's almost like the sun. Jupiter does two things for the sun. It's in trine and it's a benefic in general, so it's bound to do some good. But not only that, but it also actually helps the sun. We're going to see how sometimes a benefic, like the moon, doesn't always help a planet. It almost can cancel itself out, as we're going to see with Mercury and the moon. For now, we're talking about the sun. Jupiter is delighting this sun at 246 points. These little quotes generally come from Ernst. I guess maybe for this one I might have just sort of paraphrased from Ernst's. But Ernst Wilhelm gives us, in that article, all the Lajitaadi Avastas and what happens when we find a Lajitaadi Avasta. Highly recommended. Jupiter delighting the sun in any way, being conjunct it, or when the sun is in the sign of is in Sagittarius or Pisces, the sun will receive this Lajitaadi Avasta of delight. Jupiter delighting the sun indicates that the individual finds purpose and happiness. That's Jupiter. Through following their inspirations and creating and manifesting a better world. It's the sun. Through whatever their way of inspiration and feeling like there's dharmic purpose, like I can do something in the world, that's kind of like the sun, right? The creative impulse. It's not even necessarily to save the world, it's just it's like an intelligence principle. That's the sun. What's ultimately intelligent for me to do based on what I am, and what's best for myself. The sun can be tough because of this, like, I want what's best, but it is noble and ultimately good and important. So, by following the sun, Jupiter leaks in there and finds purpose and happiness. And it's a two-way thing because Jupiter's delighting the sun. By this joy that Jupiter feels, the sun makes a neurological connection and says, you know what? Every time I do what I want to do, what's best for me through the sun, through my inner feeling of purpose, I happen to be also expressing Jupiter. It also goes to, it's positive in the sense of what the sun does as the third lord, which can be creative and expressive. It's Gemini. It's very good for an actor, anyone with desiring a skill to talk, to communicate, even to do schoolwork. You know, Jupiter delighting a third lord as the sun would help a lot with all of this. Virtue and goodness flow through the creative faculties of the mind. When the person is creative, virtue and goodness flow through, because that's what Jupiter gives. I mean, Jupiter gives that in general, but it also gives, in this case, since this is Lajitaadi Avastas, we're not talking about Jupiter as a benefic. We're talking about the fact that Jupiter naturally co-aligns with the fulfillment of the agenda that the sun seeks. Remember, we were talking about natural law. Jupiter just rolls with the nature of what the sun is, and when they're involved together, it enlivens the sun. Not because Jupiter's a benefic, but because Jupiter and the sun are pitted towards the same nature and purpose. Again, Sheen's third lord sun did find proficient joy in at least in his activities, hobbies, and his profession as an actor. Even as a communicator, he probably enjoyed parties and being social and these sorts of things, right? So that looks all well and good, doesn't it? Well, almost, except for this one big goiter happening at the lower end of this whole situation. It's unfortunate and it's ironic, but sorry, my computer. The fact is that Saturn hitting the sun at such an opposition, Saturn is not only a malefic, which is just crippling to any planet's agenda in general due to this trauma. We talked about last time about how the Saturn is just written with trauma in general. It's just the way Saturn is. Everybody has to deal with this dimension of themselves. Although Saturn has friends, which is basically probably just Venus. Saturn's friends are Mercury and Venus. That's not to say that Saturn is a friend to Mercury, but Mercury is a friend to Saturn. So that would be like... Only Venus has Saturn for a friend, not even Mercury. It's only if Saturn is in aspect to Venus that Venus will gain something from Saturn. Otherwise, Saturn hitting anything else is malefic. Plus, it's probably involved in a Lajitaadi Avastas. So by Saturn hitting the sun, it's starving the sun, which means the sun is losing just by the fact of Saturn being in the way of the sun's sight. In fact, they're looking right at each other. Saturn is going like this, and the sun is going like this. And the sun just feels like meek in the presence of this very strong Saturn, especially this Saturn being much stronger than the sun's own natural Shad Bala. In Saturnian times, if Charlie Sheen ever goes through a Saturn period, it's going to emphasize Saturn's this aspect, and it's going to probably lay some deep impressions of meekness on Charlie Sheen overall, even though the moon and Jupiter will be helping it out. It's going to be like, come on, keep doing the sun thing. It's worth it. You've got some goodness there. But Saturn is like, Remember last time when you touched your hand on the red stove element and you felt how bad that was? Don't you remember how bad that felt, son? You better not do it again. This is the kind of thing that Saturn does. So that's Saturn just by its malefic nature, which would kind of do that to any planet. But it's particularly the sun that is more deeply affected by Saturn's trauma than anything else. It's almost like if any other planet, let's take Mercury, okay? Because you'll notice that Mercury doesn't receive, this is Mercury here, Mercury doesn't receive a Lajitaadi Avastas from Saturn, okay? I just want to paint a quick picture for you, just so you can see where I'm at with this. When Mercury dealt with Saturn, okay, Saturn is very close, is giving Mercury some negative aspect, as we saw from the Graha Aspects episode, right? So let's imagine that Mercury came along and touched its hand on the red surface. And what Saturn does is it stops us through heavy experiences and trauma. It wants us to survive. So it basically installs a red engine light that says, don't friggin' do that again or you're gonna die. Don't even think about this dimension of life or you're gonna die. Don't cross the road without looking. It's Saturn that tells us, don't jump in front of the road. And that's a good thing. When we have a well-placed Saturn, we might hear from our parents that you shouldn't cross the road. And we can see it, we look and we see a raccoon get squashed by a car and we think, oh, good thing I learned about this thing, right? Now, when you have ill placements with Saturn, you might be like, I don't know if that's true. And then you walk out in front of the road and a car almost hits you. And then you're like, whoa, and then you're spooked. And then you get away from the road. And then throughout the rest of your life, you have the proper attunement to that particular thing. Don't cross the road without looking. When you have a really bad thing with Saturn, if you get hit by a car, that's a huge trauma thing, and that's going to leave a deep mark. But if you have an ill-placed Saturn, let's say, there'll be probably some trauma associated with it, with maybe your dog will get hit by, or you will get hit by a car. In which case, 10 years later, you got hit by this car. You're walking along with your lover and you're holding their hand, and a car drives through, or they want to, I don't know, they want to cross the road, but you can't because you have this trauma, and it actually reduces your quality of life rather than doing what Saturn's supposed to do, which is pruning your life. Okay, so let's consider this example with Mercury. Mercury touched the red hot stove element, and Saturn says, oh, don't do that, and Mercury's like, oh, okay, I get it, I shouldn't have touched that, right? Now, going further in life, there'll be a memory in Mercury of that, whatever it is that Mercury touched, and it'll be bad. It'll be a negative trauma. The Mercury might have a harder time dealing with communication, dealing with managing itself, feeling confident that it can manage things. But Mercury won't leave such a... Because Mercury is not an... Saturn is not an enemy to Mercury. Saturn and Mercury are neutral, which means Saturn won't say that you are bad or ill for having tried to touch the red thing, the red stove element. Saturn in that case will just say this was a mistake you made. You have to be aware of it, and it's malefic. That is gonna suck for Mercury to deal with. The Sun, though, when the Sun touches its hand on the red thing, on the red stove element, Saturn will say, you shouldn't have done that. And the nature of the Sun is not to be told not to touch that. Mercury can hear, you shouldn't have done that, and it'll take it as like, okay, it's a game. There's a game. Right, I got it. Don't touch the bumpers or you're going to make the operation sound. Right? You know, you're playing Operation. Don't touch the sides. Mercury can hear, don't touch the sides, and take it as like, okay, so this is the nature of this game. But when you tell the Sun not to do something, the Sun is going to deeply think about it, and it's going to hit it at its core and say, maybe I shouldn't touch anything. Maybe this experience is telling me that, like, I'm just not worthy of even trying to do what I want with my life. This is what's going on with this Lajitaadi Avastas. The nature of Mercury isn't that singed by Saturn. It is, but it's not going to take it personally, and it won't have this double ill effect. But with the Sun, when Saturn touches the Sun takes it deeply personally. And this is a huge Lajitaadi Avastas expression here. This is almost all of Saturn's... this basically is like all of Saturn's full aspect. It's like basically a 60-point aspect. So we see that Saturn has 492.7 points of Shad Bala to give. And that's how much it takes out of the Sun, to the point where it has minus 141. Now, when a planet is brought down to just about zero, it's pretty hugely decimated. You know, even when a planet goes beneath its required Shad Bala points, which we know for the Sun is about like 390, when it goes below that, it's already like struggling to keep itself afloat. Although it can still stay afloat, it's just not going to be outstanding. This Saturn takes it way below zero. Like, that's deadly. Like, this Sun was told, this person, Charlie Sheen, was told at some point in life, not only to don't touch the red element. When Charlie Sheen touched that red element, his father or Saturn or the world or whatever, for some reason, caused this Sun to say, what kind of piece of crap are you for even trying? You should not even be trying anything if you're such an idiot that you would touch that red thing. You should just give up on life. This is the kind of things that this Saturn probably inflicted on this Sun. Now, the Saturn here in the 10th house is tough. It's a tough customer because it's in the 10th house for a Gemini rising, and it's a good thing because usually Saturn in the 10th teaches you how to be Saturn and to live in the world. But this Sun took it personally because it's the Sun. That's what I mean to say. Charlie Sheen in particular took this whole thing as crushing to his own sense of personality and exploration. So that's what I wanted to give that particular consciousness of how the Lajitaadi Avastas are different from the Graha Aspects. Now, specific to the chart we're dealing with, Saturn starving the Sun makes it reduces the Sun's, because of the trauma inflicted here, the Sun is like psychomimetically frozen at a subliminal way, where some other people would be like, oh, look, there's many places for me to express my Sun. There's something in Charlie Sheen at this level that is deeply blocked with its ability to express its most true self and its creative capacities. This is generally the result of poor self-esteem due to experiencing demeaning situations that left no room for success. In the individual with weak energetic disease resistance, these circumstances will, there will be circumstances where they find themselves being pushed around or unable to follow through on their ideas. I just can't. There's something blocking me. And they'll blame the universe for it instead of seeing it as a part of themselves. The sun, when it's healthy, can see whatever blocks are there, and it says, oh, this is a part of what I am. Even when there's like some kind of Saturn in the life, there's a responsibility I have. I want to be an actor, I want to be a great person, but I've got this school that I've got to go to. You know, a good sun will take that Saturn as just for what it is. But when Saturn is opposite the sun the Saturn is staring at the sun constantly. The subconscious of the person says that the reason that I'm being obstructed is because I suck. The universe just doesn't want me. I'm just a piece of crap for even trying. So, in the individual with weak emotional disease resistance, there will be circumstances where the person cannot connect, fit in, or be understood, and so they were not given the opportunities to be successful. Similar to what we heard from the Graha aspect, but it's doubled because Saturn is an enemy to the sun. Right? So all of that is basically going to, hopefully you guys can see me, all of that is painting a picture of this third lord, the sun. It's generally neutral. It's not too bad. I mean, it's actually a little bit better than without the Lajitaadi Avastas, but by a negligible 5 points of Shad Bala. That's nothing. So basically, the Lajitaadi Avastas don't necessarily affect the Shad Bala of the sun. These are all important. Goes to show you that the moon and Jupiter deeply help. They're kind of the only thing getting the sun out of this feeling that it's a piece of crap and that it's not worth it. It's not worthy of anything. The sun is still hurting for its Shad Bala here, mind you. Now, Mercury, we find, is basically the same situation. We note, first of all, that the aspect of Saturn that is on Mercury, and so is Mars too. Mars, we remember, gave it a little bit of damage, not very much. 61 points of Shad Bala, and then 155 for Saturn, which are very small, but they're neutral. So in the Lajitaadi Avastas, this doesn't denature Mercury's expression in its agenda of a fourth and first house lord. What messes with even Jupiter, what's cool about Jupiter is that Jupiter gives Mercury a benefic boost by, whenever Mercury finds itself managing things, it has a little bit of help from Jupiter's sort of sextile-y trine going on there. Just a little bit, not very much. And that's just the nature of Jupiter as a benefic. Here, what's going on, it's just a whole different layer of the thing, where Mercury is being delighted by the sun, and it's being starved by the moon, which is a very frustrating thing considering that there's so much energy going through this fourth house. This shows that the sun helps Mercury even more than it already is, but, it's the nature of Mercury being in Leo means that Mercury it gets to express its highest possible way of expressing Mercury's agenda, which is when Mercury is not doing for others per se. Mercury does really well when it's coming through Leo, because the highest desires of the self is what's fueling this management of Mercury. When Mercury is just by itself, not being helped by the sun, it's going to do what it's doing, but it might not feel inspired to. Charlie Sheen, through this delight of Mercury by the sun, he might have felt like anytime he was practicing his craft, practicing his acting, practicing his lines, that this is good, that this feels like I'm building on something that's going to be useful to me forever, because that's what the sun is. Sun is not like a fleeting, momentary opportunity. That's kind of what Mercury is. or Saturn or other planets. The sun is something that you're going to build on, which you know and feel in your heart and soul is going to be useful to you and constructive for the rest of your life. So whenever he was building on lines or even communicating, doing social partying things, he was working on his creative inspiration. This is what happens from the sun delighting Mercury. The moon starving Mercury is kind of a different thing. They are equilateral in the sense, but what happens here is that the Mercury reduces the moon, because the moon is trine Mercury, and it's quite a heavy trine. That's like exactly trine to each other. But, the moon's trines aren't as strong as Jupiter's trines. Jupiter gives 60 points of aspect in its trines. The moon only gives like 30 points when it's in aspect. At least actually, if the moon has a stronger aspect on towards the 5th house than it does towards the 9th house. So that's why this 9th house trine for the moon is only like 30 points out of a possible 60. The moon starving Mercury shows that there's an egotism involved in this planning and communicating and organizing its emotional reality. It's interesting because the Mercury is the 4th lord. It's really weird that the moon would negatively influence the 4th lord, but this is just the way this is. The 4th lord for Gemini is Mercury, which means Mercury has to be solid and unemotional in order to be emotionally fulfilled, because that's what Mercury as the 4th lord does. We're talking about the planets at their basic nature here. Now, if this Mercury has to be solid, rational, even playful, and not think too emotionally and about its own karma as it's doing what it's doing, because that's the nature of Mercury. It's playful. It sees things clearly, rationally, and objectively. What happens with this moon being trine Mercury is that the moon makes the Mercury expect things. The moon is spiritual and emotional and intuitive and emotional. And whenever the moon aspects anything, it lends an emotional sense of what's good for the self, which is good when the moon is trine its friends. But this moon being trine Mercury means that when Mercury is trying to be rational, reasonable, and when it's trying to express through the 3rd house, when it's trying to be playful and find things and communicate freely, the moon makes it emotional and looks for things through it. The moon has an agenda here, and it's removing Mercury's ability to see clearly. Mercury wants to talk with someone who could be a cool opportunity just based on what they are, and to just shoot the shit for the sake of their 4th house and even talk about things. The moon might come along at some point and say, you know what, I have certain things that I want to do. This moon is kind of in like the 7th house. So they could be like, is this person going to really bring me a contract or social instigation? The moon is looking for things, and if they don't find it in the person, or if they don't see what they're expecting, then they're just going to let the opportunity go. This doesn't feel right. When Mercury is looking through the moon, through what the moon wants to feel is right, Mercury is going to start ignoring that which is not comfortable to the moon, which is not what Mercury is for. The moon is supposed to be the moon, and Mercury is supposed to be Mercury. Mercury is supposed to be able to, in Mercury moments, look past its ego, look past what it wants, and look directly at the situation. The moon here is saying, but it feels so good when what I'm looking for through Mercury, it feels familiar. And that denatures the nature of Mercury and causes havoc for this 4th house. Because this 4th house needs to have variety and opportunity, needs to see a wide range of opportunities through Mercury in order to get what it wants. It's a mercurial vibe that this fourth house expresses itself through. If the moon closes Mercury off from looking for opportunities, the moon is just going to say, I know exactly what I need to be happy. And it won't exactly find that happiness. I mean, ironically, the moon is a benefic here. So the moon has a good nature on its own in of itself. But it is always, the moon will feel good about this familiarity that it seeks. When it's talking to people, the moon's like, oh, this person feels good and familiar to me. This is like a buddy that I can have. And Charlie Sheen probably had like a buddy sort of thing where it's like, I could do what's best for me, or I can hang out with my friend who I'm familiar with. You know, this probably didn't help his bad drug habits. That's another thing to consider. Especially because the moon is like his second lord. You know, it's developing family and these ideas of what he's going to be. His desire for closeness and familiarity probably blocked his ability to find true friends that could really help him with what he wants. Again, this is just the one Lajitaadi Avastas, but these are things, this is how this stuff plays out. Really trying to get that point that, like, the moon feels good about sticking to familiar friends, despite Mercury thinking that, like, you know, there's things that I could be doing outside of this. The moon felt good about it, felt enjoyment through it, but it did, that's because the moon is a benefic Graha aspect. At the Graha aspect level, the moon helps Mercury. But at the Lajitaadi level, which is more important, the Lajitaadi Avastas level, the moon is actually starving Mercury here. And starving Mercury's ability to express itself at its best because it's looking for what's familiar. And Mercury is not supposed to be looking for what's familiar. Mercury is supposed to think clearly and objectively no matter what. Especially for a Gemini rising. This is a Gemini Lagna. The world probably leans on Charlie Sheen for this kind of humorous, true clarity, but he probably comes through, and instead of, like, you know, Geminis are comedians, and he's probably supposed to be funny, and people probably expect him to be honest. But it's hard when you have a friend who's brutally, bluntly honest, like especially with this, you know, Jupiter, which is the seventh lord, coming through Gemini rising with Rahu there. People probably leaned on Charlie Sheen for his clarity and his truth and his honest, witty communication. And it probably sucked when he probably occasionally came through and said, but, you know, when he says something about a friend, Gemini, we lean on them for being off, like, just, it's so funny that you can't deny that it's true. But Charlie Sheen would probably be like, you know, like making fun of them and trying to get on top of them and saying, I have an ego that says I want to feel good on top of this person. So he might, like, say something that's, like, got his personal bias in it. Like, look at his teeth, though. You know, look at his teeth and the way they stick out like that. What an idiot or something like that. And this bias of his makes people question how truly clear and mercurial and rational that Charlie Sheen is being. And this denatured the nature of the Mercury, which is the center of his whole chart. It can be the same thing again with his relationships, because this is his fourth house. When he was trying to develop boundaries in himself that were good for him, and emotional boundaries and an emotional sense of self, Mercury was probably like, I don't know, this is the way I've always been. It's most comfortable for me to be with friends who are just crazy just like I am. And this is like a double negative. It's the moon is messing with the fourth house, which is ironic because the moon's the karaka for the fourth house. But this is how this stuff works, right? So, we can see Sun delights Mercury by 307 points out of 307. So that's the full, you know, if the Sun had more Shad Bala, this would be a much better Lajitaadi Avastas. But Mercury can only receive from being in Leo. This is the reason why Mercury has this full Lajitaadi Avastas. When a planet is in a sign, it receives the full Shad Bala aspect from the Lord of the sign, in this case, the Sun. As we see, receives full delight because Mercury's in the sign of Leo. So when Sun delights Mercury, The individual's vision for creating a better world, it's the sun, flows through the possibilities that's right in front of them. The person will always find opportunities right in front of them for enacting that creative inspiration of the sun. Their intelligence readily sees the greatest impossibility for the people they meet and the situations they encounter. Mercury, just being what it is, seeing people as they are, is when they do find opportunities through someone, the sun helps Mercury here. Their creative spirit and intelligence knows when they're talking to someone who is good for their sun, who's good for them, and has a possibility for them. Creative prospects for the sun give Mercury ample capacity to explore opportunities and possibilities. This must have helped Sheen land some of the gigs that got him respect for his crafts as an actor. It's a constructive, open channel for the outer planet curiosity and drive to validate self, Pluto, and to get a hold of and express the chaotic energy of Uranus through the 4th house. I do feel good because I am meeting people through these opportunities. Now, Mars, Saturn, and Jupiter are neutral to Mercury, so their Graha aspects may affect it at the benefic and malefic level, but thankfully they don't damage Mercury any further. What does damage Mercury here is the moon starving it. And you thought moon was a benefic. Well, it is, but Mercury doesn't jive with it at the basic level of Mercury. So, when the moon starves Mercury, the individual wants possibilities available to them to be what they want and need them to be. However, such is not often the case. As a result, the individual will not clearly examine the possibility in an honest light, and instead hope or imagine the possibility to be what they want, when in fact it is not, and so only disappointment follows, and again, no progress is made towards the fulfillment of life's plans, where Mercury is regarded. This is very important to this person because he's Gemini rising and all those planets are in Virgo. So the possibilities and the reality and the opportunities and even his creative capacity to just be inspired from inside to do some kind of dialogue or acting or writing or whatever it is. The moon will want it to be a certain way, and it might not reflect on what's best for the opportunities given to him. So this reduced his ability to channel positively the mob chaos energy of these outer planets. We can imagine his lunar reactivity may have blinded his clear vision a bit, frustrating with all the emphasis on his 3rd house energy. It's like the moon's emotional nature wants to be familiar with a certain thing, and the moon can even make you mute, especially when the moon starves Mercury. The moon is like looking to feel good before it can pour into whatever Mercury is expressing. And when it does, it's good, but it's because of the goodness is almost toxic. Because then the Mercury is like, ooh, when I find something that's good, I'm gonna speak to it even more. And I'm gonna speak through it even more when it feels good. But as soon as that good feeling leaves him, the muteness comes, because it's like, I'm used to only talking when it feels good and familiar. And again, this is, for someone who's a Gemini rising, the world is not always going to make you feel good. This probably has a lot to do with his drug habit. The moon being egotistical, overriding his ability to just be with what the reality is in any situation. So that was a whole lot of Chumbawamba, and sorry if it was like a lot of the same thing over and over and over. It's just, sometimes this is the way we have to zero in on these sorts of things. We have to zero in on how the moon starving Mercury affects the 4th house's ability to express and find whatever it is that the 4th house needs in order to feel like it's developing on its personal emotional foundation. It's the ability to explore that really gives this Mercury that ability. And so this is what's going on in the Lajitaadi Avastas of Charlie Sheen's chart. Now we are going to take that in the context of everything, and basically this is gonna be where we talk about the end of the general end of what we've been looking for through these videos. I might do a final word video after this, actually, but this is a final note in terms of the Lajitaadi Avastas. The question is, do the outer planets abide by Lajitaadi Avastas? We see that Saturn is influencing Pluto and Uranus here, and they're in Virgo. I'm going to kind of breeze through this because eventually we get to the end of it. This is just, I want you to get thinking critically here, because again, we're combining Vedic with Western astrology in a way that's never been done before. The Lajitaadi Avastas represent pure relationships between the purveyors of the gross energy field sheaths, which are the grahas of classic Vedic astrology. That's the 7 planets, right? Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. The outer planets have to work their 7th chakra and higher vibrations through the gross energy sheaths of the old grahas. So they don't in themselves contain the metaphysical geometry that we experience as friendship or enemies with the gross material energy field. The material plane is this 5-sided platform, and usually you're going to have an emphasis of one which has an underemphasis of the other, and they have this pentagrammatical interrelationship with each other. The outer planets don't do that. The outer planets in Vedic astrology are a developing science and history. No one's ever needed to talk about it, so there's no scriptural authority for what we're talking about. Videos like this are meant to get our astrological community considering such inquiries as the following. Does Saturn have an inherent relationship with Uranus and Pluto? We would say yes, but it's not based on the same cosmic framework as the other planets. Direct aspects to outer planets are generally inherently neutral, in my opinion, and vice versa, but they are amplifying to whatever is the theme related to the planets. We could read an excerpt from a Western author about a Saturn opposite Uranus aspect like we have, and we'll see neutrality, but often with possible pratfalls and pitfalls, depending on the karma of the person. Usually, for example, with Saturn, Uranus is going to tickle Saturn and make it uncomfortable with the structure that Saturn is supposed to do, but eventually Saturn can find structure within the chaos, and that's how Saturn and Uranus work together if Uranus is expressing itself healthily through its house and lord and finds stability. If Uranus can find the stability, then Saturn can be broken up but still have the energy field working positively so that Saturn can recrystallize itself. It's probably always going to be a thing when you have Saturn and Uranus interacting with each other. It won't be inherently good or bad, although Saturn is inherently bad and malefic to Uranus at the Graha aspect level, but not at the Lajitaadi one. And this is the question. It's a matter of confluence, I'd say. The outer planets must use the classical grahas to express themselves through. Therefore, in a way, they take on the qualities of their lord. So when Saturn, for example, is opposite Uranus and Pluto in Virgo, do the planets receive a Lajitaadi Avasta resonant? See. Part of the problem here is at first I made the mistake in thinking that Saturn was an enemy or that it starved Mercury. I kind of messed that up, unfortunately, here, but the question is Saturn neutral to these planets when they're in Virgo? Western astrology has waxed philosophic about this since the last century, but we're talking about Jyotish here. So this is like kind of the question. Do Sheen's outer planets, which seeks to express themselves through Virgo, the 4th house, and Mercury, do they take on the auric field of Mercury? Therefore, does Saturn's mindset help these planets ground themselves here, as Saturn delighting Mercury would entail? It's kind of frustrating because this is all kind of wrong, but what I'm trying to get at here with this is, the question is, I wish I could maybe take another example, like if these outer planets were in Leo and Saturn was opposite them, would they take on the auric field of Leo and the Sun? And would therefore Saturn's aspect on Uranus and Pluto be heavier because they are taking on the quality of the Sun? This is the question. And my opinion on the subject is that while confluence is always a concern, the health of the house lord signifies whether the direct Graha aspect to an outer planet will either destroy the outer planet or help it grow. It's the house lord of the house is really the determining factor of overall health as to whether a malefic like Saturn would wipe these planets out. The outer planets do take on the auric field of their house and lord, and that lord holds the true auric field of Pluto and Uranus through Mercury. But the house is, a holding cell for that energy. The outer planet occupying that house is not affected by the traditional friendship enemies between classical planets. So just because these planets are in Virgo doesn't mean Saturn is going to hit them as if they were Mercury. I just felt like I should speak to that. I hope that wasn't too confusing. I hope you guys can see the debate, the argument that's being expressed here. All in all, my point is, I would say, is that Saturn affects these planets as a malefic, but it doesn't affect them as an enemy. Although Saturn does affect Sun as an enemy and Mercury as a neutral, because as we can see, Saturn is neutral to Mercury. The Graha aspect of Saturn will always damage an outer planet in some way by virtue of its malefic nature. But whether this will make the outer planets unstable or will ground it is a matter of confluence and health for the house and lord. Because Saturn does and can ultimately ground things. It's really mostly only Venus that's like friendly to it. Mercury is neutral, and Saturn will still have a building constructive quality on Mercury. But it's really up to the health of Mercury as to whether these outer planets will be hurt by Saturn ultimately. Ultimately, I say again that Saturn will damage these outer planets more than it'll help them, ultimately. It's the positive aspects that will help these planets. Positive aspects from benefics that will help an outer planet. So sorry if this is confusing, but this is the kind of critical thinking we need to employ when dealing with the cross-pollination of cultural theologies, as we are doing with this series, Marrying Western and Vedic Astrology Interpretation. So now this is like a little bit of a grand total picture of our whole thing. Let's see, we're about an hour in. We see that with the auspiciousness to the Lagna, Mercury was auspicious to Gemini Lagna, but it's placed in the third house, which is inauspicious, so that's neutral. Dignity we found to be pretty stable. Prosperity was neutral, leaning towards unstable. I'm going to end up calling it neutral. Shad Bala was unstable because of the Sun, and also Mercury is not. It's at its standard level of needing the Shad Bala it requires. But it wasn't outstanding. The Graha aspects happened, but it ended up being the benefics and malefics hit both the outer planets as well as Mercury and the Sun, basically equal. I'd call it neutral. Same thing with the Lajitaadi Avastas. There were aspects, but the benefic influences balanced with the malefic influences. Although in Saturnian times and Saturn dashas and such, the Saturn will probably emphasize the damage that it does to not only these planets but also those outer planets as well. So far, most of these are looking pretty neutral, as we're going to see. We're going to do our last planetary roundup of this whole chart in our next episode. And we're probably also going to talk about the Vargas as a final note as well. So, this has been a long video already, so I'm going to let you guys go for now. And then our last video is going to wrap up this series, and we're going to continue the series as we go along. For now, I'm Dustin Cormier for How to Rock Astrology. This has been the Lajitaadi Avastas of Charlie Sheen, as relates to the agenda of the outer planets in Charlie Sheen's chart, being significant points in his chart. Thanks for watching, folks, and I'll see you guys on the next episode.